This should be information that underlines what we need to do to move this country forward. Well, hello, everybody. It's August the 6th, 2026, the year of our Lord, and my name is David Leis. I'm your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier. Today, we're going to talk about a big topic, namely COVID-19. And in particular, you may have heard about the U.S. Senate hearings with a fellow by the name of Dr. Anthony Fauci. So the question is, why do those hearings matter for not only persons in the United States of America, but for Canadians? What does it mean as we see the revelations coming out of emails, diaries, all kinds of communications that were once private that reveal a lot of truths from Dr. Anthony Fauci's pen? So we're going to talk about the implications of that, as Dr. Fauci talked about himself being the science. So this is going to be quite a conversation. We've got the A-team panel here, and we're going to turn to them in a moment, but you won't want to miss this discussion, and we welcome your comments. And speaking of comments, we're very grateful for them. This is one of thousands we get. Well, this has been a very sobering, eye-opening, frightening conversation. Thank you. And that's from Jillian. And I think that was regarding our last live. This is your absolute best guest ever. Keep up the great work. And that's from Cynthia Workman. And I think that was in response to the release of my discussion with Colonel David Redman about Canada's security. We need to share this podcast with everyone. And that is from LVDK. So thank you very much for those comments and keep them coming. We really do appreciate them. And now turning to some headlines as people come on board. Manitoba's first supervised consumption site is to begin on August the 11th as they join a number of provinces that have gone this pathway. Ottawa fights a massive $5 billion land claim for much of downtown Ottawa, including Parliament Hill land, and those claims are about affirming Indigenous title rights. So what do you think about that one as we are confronted with many of those claims now right across the country? This was an interesting headline. Just over 1 in 3 workers use generative artificial intelligence tools at work in the past 12 months. So that is significant, and it continues to increase in terms of the level of use of AI as a tool. What do you think about that? 1 in 10 employers now, according to federal documents, I believe, confirmed that are hiring temporary foreign workers, and they're found to be violating federal rules. And then we also have Canada and the United States continuing trade talks. We have our representatives back in Washington as we try to come to an agreement before the imminent deadline. We also know that the U.S. State Department has closing the Winnipeg consulate, among other foreign missions, as a cost-saving measure. And we also, of course, will come to our topic at hand about Fauci's decision to invoke the Fifth Amendment. And this is a very interesting point. I believe it's just in that Dr. Fauci was held in contempt now with the U.S. Senate. I believe that just came out this morning. So as we turn to the topic at hand, we know a little bit about the history. It almost seems like a bad dream, a bad movie, where Dr. Fauci was certainly one of the lead historic figures in talking about guidance in terms of how COVID-19 would be managed, not only in the United States, but many countries, including Canada, took their cue from Dr. Fauci. And we've got a big agenda here, so we'll just highlight this briefly. Why are these hearings happening now? What are the top 5 revelations and why? And we'll look to our panel for insight there as well. What was their biggest surprise? And frankly, what are your comments regarding that? And what does this mean for Canadians? So we've got a big show here. I want to highlight, just before I introduce our panel, is some straw polls that we took. We took 2 of them. The first one was, what is the biggest lesson Canada should take away from the COVID pandemic? And one was 24% more transparency from government, better scientific debate and accountability. Imagine that at 66%. stronger emergency preparedness at 3, and we need to move on and focus on the future at 7%. And that was posted just 22 hours ago, and we had over 1,000 votes. And should public officials be required to explain major pandemic decisions years later? And according to this, 97% said yes. So thank you very much for that feedback. And on to our panel, we've got an incredible team here. And I want to introduce Trish Wood. And Trish is a well-known journalist. We recall her through the years with the famous, great slip of the tongue there, Trish, as we relate to the CBC, but with the Fifth Estate. And
that works. Infamous works.
Yes, infamous works. And then also we think of your podcasts, Trish Wood Is Critical, and you also have Substack. So a warm welcome to you, Trish.
Thanks. Nice to be back.
And we, of course, have the great Ken Drysdale. He's the former co-chair and good all-around guy of the National Citizens Inquiry. And we're delighted you could be with us, Ken.
Good afternoon. Good to see everybody.
And of course, our regular Dr. Marco Navarro-Genie, Vice President of Research at Frontier. A warm welcome to you, Marco.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
So, my friends, I want to start off with really a baseline question. What is the biggest revelation as you've listened to this last week or two of Dr. Anthony's revelations, both his diary? What were the top 2 revelations that come to your mind? And before I start with Trish Wood on this question, I do want to note that, of course, Dr. Fauci is quite famous now because I think he's invoked the Fifth Amendment more than any other Senate witness in history. I think he's evoked it some 111 times, and we'll get to that in a moment. But Trish, do you want to start first?
Sure. Well, I'll start just by personally saying that watching those hearings was very emotional for me because I did cover Dr. Fauci back in the AIDS times when I was at CBC, when young men were dropping like flies and a proper public response was desperately needed. It was not coming. He was hated by the AIDS activist groups. And I know they've had a bit of a rapprochement since then, but at the time it was really understandable. They used to burn him in effigy outside the NIH during AIDS. And I'll explain why in a second. So watching him in the hot seat, even though he didn't say anything and invoke the Fifth, I think more than 100 times. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but that feels like...
I believe it's 111 times.
111 times. It felt both alternatively good that somebody was finally holding him to account, or at least making the effort to do so, but also extremely frustrating that this guy, for reasons I cannot explain, has been at the levers of public health authority and power in America, which means kind of peripherally in all Western countries, because we take our guidance from them, for I think about 40 years, not at the top for 40 years, but at the NIH for 40 years. So, and I still am not seeing him going in a direction where he's going to actually, literally be held accountable beyond me just feeling good that he's being beaten up by Rand Paul. And there was an announcement today, which I'll talk about in a second, but it was emotional for me. In a way, I wish he'd go away because I feel like he's done so much damage to so many people, and that the big event around Tony Fauci will be that the people on the other side of the aisle on this, mostly who are liberal and Democrat, that's how the public health argument has broken down, when they kind of come to see what's happened and how he's kind of used the political dynamic in order to enable things that have not been good for people, but have been good for him.
Okay, what a summation. Trish, I want to pick up something what you said earlier, just so the audience understands this. I have never met Dr. Anthony Fauci, but you did years ago.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
I met him a couple of times at AIDS conferences. They used to every 2 years, they have these big massive conferences and everybody would show up. Bob Gallo, who kind of incorrectly stated that he'd isolated the virus when in fact it had mostly been the French. They would all show up to kind of show off and be big, sexy public health guys. And Fauci was always there. But then later, when I was at CBC covering AIDS and Fauci, I actually went to the NIH. This was for the Fifth Estate. It never ran, sadly. It was probably one of the best interviews I've done. But I went with a crew and a stack of research and did a pretty heavy duty Mike Wallace type accountability interview with him. And it went about the way one might think based on what we saw at the hearings. He's a very arrogant guy. He doesn't like to be challenged. I tend to dig in pretty hard when I'm going after somebody who I think has done something wrong and who should be held accountable. So it was a pretty big dust up, but it revealed a lot about his personality. And I said in a Substack after those hearings that I do think, this is just my opinion, that he does have some kind of a personality disorder at work as well. He's not just there for the good of science and humanity, in my opinion, based on my experiences with him. So that's very dangerous in my view.
Okay. Well, very interesting background. We'll get back to that in a moment. So Ken Drysdale, former chair of the National Citizens Inquiry, one of the few vehicles that was, had a pretty significant public profile as he went across the country, holding hearings about the impacts of COVID-19 on Canadians. So what's your reaction? What are there top revelations that have come to your mind when you saw these hearings?
I was one of the unfortunate few, I think, who actually read these diaries. And, I'm a human being. So the first thing that came to my mind was the salacious issues in there. But there's no point in discussing those. But there are quite a few salacious issues in those documents. But I think probably one of the most important things that I gathered out of reading these things was what was not in them, number one. And number two, when you noticed or you listened to the way he was discussing certain things, and they had a tremendous amount of uncertainty around the around the effectiveness of the vaccines. They had lots of conversations about hydroxychloroquine, all kinds of things. And what I drew out of that was they were making decisions. Fauci was making decisions and recommendations based on his personal feelings, political influences that were unique to the United States. Things he was making decisions based on how he thought he could be promoting the vaccine. And so my question for the Canadian side, and I think that's important, is how did the Canadians independently come up with the same solutions that Fauci did when his decision making was based on personal issues, had to do with political issues within the United States? So how could Canada come up with the same decisions independently? It's not possible unless they were just blindly following the lead. And I just want to step back to my first point. My first point was the things that were missing. For instance, he mentioned ivermectin once, and it was in a referral to a newspaper article where somebody said something about ivermectin and he was criticizing the person. But there was no discussion in that whole diary about ivermectin. There was a slight discussion about hydroxychloroquine. There was absolutely no discussion or mention of VAERS data. There was no discussion of the post-marketing analysis that came out, I believe, if I remember correctly, was in March or February of 2022. And one of the reasons that stood out to me so heavily is that you may remember that I also, prior to my involvement with the National Citizens Inquiry, and I've retired from there a year ago or so, but I wrote a report which was an indictment to the police about things that I said were going wrong or were done wrong. And one of the questions I asked on page 11 of that report was, when did health officials, I'm just going to read it, although a key question is, when did health officials know or ought to have known? It was clear that they knew no later than May of 2021 what the actual nature of the pandemic was. These officials also knew which measures were effective and which were ineffective. And so I quoted that in March of 2022. And I said, well, they must have known by May, but the Fauci diaries tell us that they knew back in January of 2020 that this COVID virus was dangerous to older people, people with comorbidities, and that youth were not really in any danger. So
Mhm.
he pushed back my own narrative by a year and a half or a year and a quarter about when they knew. And so, how do you explain that they knew those things, the fundamentals, but they did the opposite? So, maybe that's a funny answer in
Mhm.
that a lot of what shocked me was what wasn't in, and the other part is that they knew
Mhm.
in 2020 what this animal was, and yet they did something completely counterproductive to it.
Okay, thank you very much, Ken. It's quite an insight. I like the idea that you're also highlighting what was not in these documents. Is kind of says something in itself, but also that there's this knowledge that clearly underlines that they knew what they were dealing with at the time, and yet it was not addressed. So it is really quite a remarkable revelation. Thank you, Ken. Marco, your response.
I think I would agree with Ken about stuff that is missing, but we have to be also aware that this is an incomplete document, that this is not a diary from A to Z, that it was basically cobbled up bits and pieces from things that were found on different servers in the government of the United States. That there are at least something like 6.5 months of entries missing, not because we don't know whether he actually didn't write during those 6 months, or because the bits and pieces that they put together did not locate those, and so there are things that are missing, but it might not be because they were hidden, but because there is a significant chunk of the diaries not there. I read through the whole thing and came across with a very similar impression that Ken has. But I would say the things that shocked me most, or surprised me most, and they shouldn't have, were because they kind of reinforce a good deal of the stuff that Barry Cooper and I covered in the book on the pandemic. One of them, for example, was that they knew with sort of very, very strong evidence that this was not a natural origin
Yeah.
pathogen. We all remember that when people talked about that. I remember the first interview that I did with Radio Canada. They asked me if I wasn't worried about being labeled a conspiracy theorist, because we were talking about the controversy regarding the origin of the virus. And so that is an interesting one, if nothing else, for the record. The other one that I found somewhat disturbing, and Ken has already alluded to it as well as Trish, is the political nature of this. And there are probably 1,700 different ways to enter at this idea that it was politically driven, because there are so many different examples. But the one that kind of hit me the most was that they had a pretty good idea that the vaccine, so-called, did not contain the contagion, that people who were vaccinated were spreading the virus just as much, and in some cases more than regular people who had not been vaccinated. And the political nature of this comes probably the most visible in a segment where he being Dr. Fauci, talks about how he pushed Walensky from CDC
Mhm.
into basically saying, reversing a decision that she was about to take regarding the boosts. There was a vote of a committee inside the CDC, and they voted 6-9 against recommending people under the age of 65 to receive the boosts. And
Wait a sec. Can
Fauci,
you repeat that? Because that is like a really critical headline
Yeah,
that
so a committee of
internal leaders
scientists,
in the CDC,
a
scientists, were
scientists
disagreeing with Fauci.
recommended that there be no boosts for people under the age of 65. So when Walensky talks to Fauci and Fauci talks to Walensky, Fauci pushes her to say, well, that's not unanimous, 6-9. And so she reverses basically the direction in which she was going, and they recommend that everybody be boosted. And then going back to the issue of communications, because we heard that Fauci wasn't picked because he was the best knowledgeable guy, but because he was the most effective communicator, or so they thought. That he says that the reason why he pushed for that was so that there wouldn't be any complications. He didn't want to mix people up, because we know that all of us are dopes, I guess, and don't understand the threshold of 65 or before or after. But there was no scientific basis, going back to what Ken was saying, for the decisions, and that's just one. The mask decision comes up again. That he was also, flip-flop. He pushed governors in 2 different states to close schools. And then 6 months later, he was arguing that all the schools should be open. So what is at stake here really is an indictment not just of Mr. Science as he portrayed himself, but of the scientific processes. There is an intellectual crisis in these pages here.
There really are. We've got a lot of comments from the audience as we talk about what are the implications of the revelations around Dr. Fauci's diary and other emails. And I think that's a good caveat, Marco, that you say this is really an incomplete record. There's many, many more records to come. So stay tuned, everybody. But what we know so far is really quite extraordinary, confirming what were the private communications and versus the public explanations were really at odds with each other regarding many things, including vaccine efficacy. It was also very much the impact on children, and just as you were alluding to, around the necessity to act on people under age 65. And then we also have the whole issues around the disregard for the impact on the economy. I mean, it just goes on and on in terms of the contradictions here, in terms of what we're told, even about social distancing, these absurd circles on floors that somehow you had to stay within your circle so we wouldn't spread the virus. Even the efficacy of masks was all in there. You've got all kinds of evidence that says, I guess, Trish, I want to ask you, is there anything that was said publicly that actually ended up being on solid ground here? What's your comment?
Well, my sense to answer that question is that no, I didn't feel that way. But I think based on the discussion we're having here, we could maybe take a step back and globally look at how dangerous this is, what just happened to us all here. Because what is being revealed is that the dissidents were all right about everything, virtually. And we were censored. Great people like Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff. I don't think Martin lost his job at Harvard, but he maybe, I don't remember, but he was certainly, he was certainly, treated like a nutcase. And Jay, who is one of the brightest people I know, I also love him. He's a very nice guy. The heroes who were getting it right, and the information people, me and the people who were working as sort of dissident podcasters and the like, Tucker Carlson was another, were all absolutely demonized. And it turns out that we were all right. So you have to think about, in a larger sense, what does this mean? It means that people who are not truth tellers, who are operating, in my view, for political engagement or personal gain, can win the day in a democracy, while the people who are risking to get it right are treated as irredeemable. I think that is the most important thing to come out of what we're seeing now with the kind of downfall of Tony Fauci. Why did he have so much power? Why was he allowed to go after Jay? What did he say? They were fringe. And all he had to do was say, don't listen to the Great Barrington Declaration because I'm the science, and the media lined up behind him and agreed, and therefore kids couldn't go to school. I mean, it was insane what happened. And that's why he in my opinion, right now is such a big deal because he's emerged like one of these historical figures. I'm not going to name them, but we all know who I'm talking about, who get into these authoritarian situations and can do no wrong. And there's no pushback that can be enabled in order to stop it, right? Like he was a train coming down the track. And it was very, very difficult for credible people who had scientific arguments to be heard.
Right on. Yeah. So in this society, both in Canada, elsewhere, United States, Fauci gave the cover for enormous public policy decisions to be made that had enormous impact and harm on people's lives from top to bottom. Yeah. I want to just share with you an interesting clip. It's from an interview I did a few months ago with who is now, ironically, one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, as you mentioned, Trish. And he was now, ironically, the head of the National Institute of Health, the NIH, the successor, if you will, for Dr. Anthony Fauci. So I want to share this clip with you from that interview. You were one of the co-authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. All kinds of parties viciously go after you personally after things that were just basically common sense, things like asserting natural immunity.
You're absolutely right, David, that it was just common sense. So the idea of the Great Barrington Declaration was the risk of COVID in 2020, and even now, was so much greater for old people than for young people. So the Great Barrington Declaration said, protect old people better, and for young people, let them live their lives. Let them go to school, let them play with their friends, let them like do what young people do. And that's how we dealt with all other pandemics, all respiratory virus pandemics. But it came across as shocking in the context of October 2020. And the various parts of public health that dominated public health at the time, the leaders of public health, abused their power to suppress any conversation about it. Like I remember it being discussed by the CBC in October 2020, accusing me of being a fringe figure, that I wanted to like let the virus rip and kill people. It literally said to help protect the lives of older people better. That was the key plank of it. So the whole thing was just heartbreaking. And I think public health authorities who were in charge then, they really did abuse their power and bear considerable responsibility for the situation we're currently in.
Check out the full episodes on YouTube. We get real, we go deep, and it's made for people just like you. Okay, so speaking of people just like ourselves here, what's your response, Ken, as you hear that clip and reflection from Jay Bhattacharya? It's just pretty remarkable.
Maybe they're not hearing.
There we go. I know. The button wasn't working on my mute. I'm sure my wife would like to have a mute on me at work sometimes. You know, there are a couple things about Jay Bhattacharya. And an interesting little funny story that you guys may not remember. Our $1.4 billion CBC covered the NCI hearings once. They brought in a camera crew in Winnipeg and filmed it. And you know what they filmed and broadcast? They broadcast Ray Bhattacharya on the screen talking about how he had been censored by the CBC. Funny little story, by the way. And I was at CBC a few months ago talking to them about that, and they weren't aware of that. And
isn't that interesting? So just to clarify, so Dr. Jay Bhattacharya gave testimony to one of those hearings in Winnipeg. The CBC shows up to one of the many, many hearings you had across the country, and they zero in on one issue, namely this guy.
Right, and he didn't appear in person, but we had a giant screen, and and he was actually talking about CBC censoring him, and the CBC crews there filming it. And of course, they put that out, and they don't even know what he's saying. That's how much attention they spent.
Yeah. Okay. So isn't that ironic? But clearly, censorship was the game, as you saw science thrives in an environment where you need debate. You need to be able to have the discussion as you seek the truth and be able to look at, what is it called? Oh, yeah, facts and evidence. And yet, the powers and authorities didn't follow best practice when it came to managing pandemics. They didn't follow those pandemic plans, including in Canada, but instead it was a power game to suppress the kind of discussion. I think so, Trish, your point earlier is that they were suppressing truth tellers, and that debate really says, or really reflects a dark time within our democratic society, doesn't it?
Well, let's talk about Jay, because we were the first people to have him on a podcast of anybody.
Mhm.
And I actually connected with him. He was sitting in a restaurant in his hotel in Washington, having just met with the president, on his cell phone. And I'm thinking, who is this guy? This is interesting. What are they doing?
Mhm.
And so we had him on. I'm super proud of that. But in short order, he was censored, really censored by the Jack Dorsey regime at Twitter. I mean, they just kicked him off. I don't know if you remember how bad it was. It wasn't just people being shadow banned or,
Mhm.
kind of minor little algorithmic trickery. I mean, he was actually kicked off and then reinstated when Elon bought it. And the funny thing about Jay is if you watch that clip or you see any of the jillions of interviews he's done, he is reasoned and respectful and kind and super data driven. So
Mhm.
you got to ask yourself, what were they so afraid of with this guy?
Mm.
And actually, those were the things that they were afraid of, because he was making a very simple point, and it drove those of us who really dug in the information space, which is
Mhm.
this: when public health starts doing more damage to the citizenry in order to save them from a pathogen, when what they're doing is more dangerous, that's when you've got to call a halt and say, this is not a consensus, we need to have a discussion. And you'll recall we could never move that ball down the field. And I would sit in my home podcasting studio thinking, well, wait a minute, what if those high school kids who are not going to school now are so isolated they start committing suicide, or they start doing
Mhm.
drugs or something? Like, what if all of these crazy public health measures they're doing actually end up hurting? And so I would look around for the data that public health used in order to convince themselves that they weren't doing something more harmful. And I learned that there was no data. They weren't doing those calculations at all. So what we had, and this was Jay's big thing, right? This was, he'd say, protect the old people who might die from it, or people who are
Mhm.
compromised, and let everybody else lead their lives, because that's the healthy way to do it. And my understanding, maybe something has happened sort of post-COVID, but I never saw a study that said that lockdowns did less damage than COVID would have to
Mhm.
the general population.
Mhm.
I never saw that. Maybe it exists, maybe not, but it certainly hasn't been proven to me in any way that I would fully take on board that lockdowns did anything but cause a great deal of harm to a great many people. And
Yeah.
if I could just say this one last thing, I don't think we've recovered from it. I
Mhm.
think many people have PTSD. I include myself a little bit in it, because think about what they did. We're used to it now because we've been living with it for 6 years,
Mhm.
but think about what they did, the cruelty of what they
Mhm.
did to us. It was so anti-human and anti what we need as a species to survive, which is each other
Mhm.
and a spiritual life. And all of that was shut down for periods of time that we were never told when they were going to end. And we sort of come through that with no redemptive discussions about it. I mean, it's
Mhm.
an awful, awful thing that happened, which is, I guess, why we're here today.
Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah, well said, Trish. And I just want to underline so much of what you said in terms of not following the best practice of a pandemic. So this is just extraordinarily in contrast, and it begs serious questions at so many levels. And beginning with how we chose to manage this pandemic versus other countries that did not do a lockdown approach, that did follow best practice. And I
Yeah.
think that Jay underlines this among others, is the country of Sweden. And
Yeah.
the data is in. The data is there that contrasts the mortality rates, the economic impacts. They had no lockdowns. They did not close their schools. There were other challenges they had, but they did an extraordinarily successful model, and we still to this day don't really hear that in the public square, certainly in Canada, about that. I tell you, I have a confession. Last week, I finally deleted my app in my province that related to my vaccination. And I am shocked that it took me this long to finally do it, as I was looking for maybe more memory within my
God.
computer. But I said, I just can't believe that it's been sitting there all this time. And it's a kind of a mere little symbol of moving beyond this incredible tragedy that didn't have to be, I would argue. So anyway, so much comments here. Marco, I'm intrigued about your perspective on this as well as a political scientist, because I look at this and I think I have never seen a situation. I would never believe that in so many countries, the US has its own story around electoral law changes with mail-in ballots and all the rest. But in Canada, where we had finally people rise up, and they were called the truckers. And I'll never forget Martin Koldorf, one of the other authors that's been cited of the Great Barrington Declaration, telling me a number of times, saying the truckers were a great inspiration right around the world as they followed the science. And they themselves were vilified, demonized, and not even welcomed into Ottawa as citizen protesters. And they themselves ended up being debanked, and a number of them are still being not prosecuted, but persecuted. So what does this say about the impacts of this on our democracy?
Let me pick up, thank you. Let me pick up on one of the last things that Trish said, because there is a connection to this whole conversation. That this was an anti-human sort of set of activities. And the contradiction, of course, embedded into that is that it was promoted as life-saving, meaning human lives saving. Just a couple of days ago, the former premier of my province tweeted thanking the president for having adopted this life-saving vaccine that he said saved millions of lives. So this is still going on that argument that they were saving lives. And so one of the things that political scientists do, if not probably the main thing that political scientists do, is to study power. And when Barry and I wrote this book, we looked at it from the lens of power, essentially, and this idea of moral panic, that is a feature of it, as a significant feature of it, is the retention, the capture, the promotion of political power. And you can see it going back to the document that we're talking about, Dr. Fauci, how in his own arrogance, when he declared himself to be science, to speak for science, that to question him was to question science, and the way that he dealt with colleagues who were just as intelligent, just as prepared and educated as he, including Jay. But there's a significant amount of stuff in the diaries about how he viewed Scott Atlas, for example, who was brought from Stanford by the president to advise him on it. And Atlas had a very, but a diametrically opposed, to use a cliche, view of the pandemic and how to treat it. And Dr. Fauci refers to the signatories and the promoters of the Barrington Declaration as Atlas's three stooges. He says this is the contempt that he had for colleagues of enormously well respected around the world. That reflects a relationship of power. It wasn't about the science. It wasn't about respect between people. It was simply about his position in the White House, and he saw it eroded by the presence of Scott Atlas in there. And so flip that around, and now let's look at the policies. So there is a struggle for power in and around Fauci in that way. And then he wants to exercise that power by commanding the obedience of the population. A lot of these policies had very little to do with health or public health. It has something to do with people will obey what we say.
Yeah.
And that was the main driver. So when you look at it from the point of view of power, I mean, Fauci was well aware, and he writes also in the diaries, that there would be millions of children who would be affected for lack of vaccinations, other vaccinations. He honed in on measles, and he says it, right, that there would be millions of children that could die from measles infections because they were not being vaccinated because everything was shut down. He talks about that in about 3 sentences in the diaries, and then he moves on like it never happened,
Yeah.
right? And so there is this sort of deep dismissing of fundamental moral questions,
Yes.
ethical issues, human issues, and the instrument really is the exercise of power.
You just
Well said.
summarized why I drove on with my podcast for 5 years. Absolutely relentlessly, because of what you said. There are a lot of people who don't understand what you're saying. There are people who don't understand why it's upsetting for me to see that my neighbor is going to snitch on somebody in my building who isn't wearing a mask. If you don't have historical reverberations about that, and you're pointing a finger at
Mhm.
someone and saying, we're going to report you to the authorities, where our society is breaking apart when that becomes acceptable behavior for people. So I agree with you. This is about humanity. My friend Ann Bauer said to me early on in our friendship, she's a great essayist and she's Jewish. And she said, the way people are reacting to COVID and lockdowns in particular, and then snitching as an offshoot of that, reminded her of what her parents told her, and that is, make friends with people who you know will hide you in the attic.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, which sounds maybe overly dramatic, but I became very, very close friends with people who were dissidents like I was. I don't think we were dissident. I think we were just seeing things very clearly and understood the science very well. I don't think there was anything strange about that at all. And I think maybe that's why I so deeply fell in love with The Convoy, who I'm doing a big documentary on right now, because they were plain speaking, deeply humane people who saw through the emperor's new clothes when all of the kind of high and mighty PhDs were getting it wrong. And that was meaningful for me as a journalist.
Well said, Trish. And thank you for your leadership as well, for being one of those voices. And Ken, you were one of those voices as well. Do you think there'll be a reckoning in Canada? I mean, obviously in public policy, we look for many key principles, one of which is transparency. We know there's millions of documents that the government federally and different provinces have chosen not to release, which says something. And without transparency, you can't have accountability. So do you see green shoots of hope in Canada that we'll ever see a reckoning here? Like we're seeing really kind of, in many ways, the start of that in the United States.
Well, I think you only have to point to the Sean Hartman legal ruling that occurred in the last month or two to answer that question. So,
And what is that ruling? Can you help?
of course,
understand?
Sean Hartman was a 17-year-old boy who played hockey during COVID. They wouldn't let him play unless he got the shot without his father's permission. He would have got the shot. And a few months later, this healthy athlete was found dead in his bedroom. So his father, Dan Hartman, sued the Health Canada and the federal government, and he's also sued, I think it's Pfizer. And the court ruled, essentially, that Health Canada did not owe Mr. Hartman a duty of care. They said, the court ruled, they didn't rule on whether or not Sean died from the vaccine. They didn't rule on whether or not the boy relied on it or had any kind of co-problems. But what they said is because Health Canada had told all Canadians it was safe and effective, and they were involved with getting employers and schools and whoever it is to force people to take it, because they said it to all Canadians, they had no responsibility to individual Canadians. That's mind-boggling. That Health Canada, who said it was safe and effective, and I want to just jump back for a second about this whole efficacy thing, because I think that's a bit of a burr in my saddle. But they told us it was safe and effective. They pushed the narrative. They hid the numbers. So this wasn't just about censorship. And this is where I want to go back to the efficacy thing, because Fauci talked a lot in his diary about efficacy, and they called it 95% efficacy. And we all knew they were calling it 95% efficacy. That's something called relative efficacy. And according to rulings that happened in Canada before COVID, you're not supposed to, a drug advertiser or is not supposed to just report relative efficacy, because it's meaningless. And I'll explain that in just a second. But there was a Health Canada ruling in 2019, and it had to do with a case about aspirin use in Canada. And they said that you can't just give a relative efficacy because it's meaningless. And let me explain that. If I buy a lotto ticket and there's 10 million people that buy a lotto ticket, my chance of winning is 1 in 10 million. Whatever that is in percent, that's a very, very tiny number. If I buy 2 lotto tickets, my chance of winning is still 1 in 5 million, almost no change. So that's absolute efficacy. Relative efficacy is, well, Ken, you bought 2 tickets, so you're 50% higher. You're 50% efficacy of winning. And that's what they did with us in COVID. And that was ruled not only in Canada that you're not supposed to do that, but the Association of Pharmaceutical Advertisers ruled on that. And in the mid 2000s, the Health Canada ruled that you weren't supposed to say that. And yet Canada and United States and a lot of places went ahead and just reported this relative efficacy. And people thought, oh my goodness, if I take this thing, 95% chance I'm not going to get it. And that's just not true. The actual efficacy absolutely of this was about 0.6%. That was your actual absolute efficacy on these things. Now, so I think it's an important point here that they weren't only censoring, but they were manipulating the data, even against rulings like the ruling in Canada in 2019 that you shouldn't be doing this. And that also went into we talk about pandemic planning. We need better pandemic planning. That was one of the things that was in your survey. But we did have a great pandemic plan.
We really did. Yes.
And it said, do not close down schools. Do not mask. And you know who one of the authors of that was? Theresa Tam. Amongst all the other people who were at the time provincial health officials, etc., they were all a part of that. So this wasn't just about, it's an incredible thing if you really think about it. It wasn't just about trying to silence us from the large to the small, but it was also about taking known science, known response, known issues that you knew were misleading or that a pandemic plan was there and you could have used it, and throwing that aside and doing something different. Even in your survey, you had a thing in there about emergency preparedness, and it wasn't a very large number, but whatever the number was, 6% or something. We have an incredible emergency preparedness system in Canada, but they ignored it. So they took these medical people that honestly don't know anything about emergency response on a large scale basis. And I'm not saying you break your leg, they don't know how to deal with that. But on a large scale basis, they should have went to EMO Canada and let EMO lead this thing with advice and guidance from the medical, as opposed to the medical trying to do all of this crazy stuff. And a good example of that in Fauci's diary, it was kind of funny. He was talking about how many million COVID tests they had done, but they didn't have the swabs to do any more. So they had all these COVID tests sitting there, and they didn't have swabs because nobody thought to order the darn things.
Yeah, no, it is a very powerful point. We didn't follow the emergency plans, and it does go back to this point that it seemed like the exercise here, based on Fauci's testimony, or pardon me, his covert testimony vis-a-vis his diary and emails, this was a political issue, is to be managed as a power game rather than through best practices as an emergency plan. So this is, it is really quite an extraordinary time in our history. And so my question then going forward is, when we talk about solutions here, we've got a slide here, Madam Producer, about the next stage here. What are your recommendations for where we should go forward on this? What about releasing the millions of Canadian documents? Is there opportunity for accountability? What are the next steps? So I want to go back to you, Trish. Any recommendations in terms of what we need to do to bring, and you used an interesting word, healing, or even truth-telling when it comes to the future here?
I don't think there will be truth-telling. I don't think Tony Fauci in the States is going to pay a big price either. I think it's theater. And I don't feel optimistic about it. I think that people in positions of power who are vulnerable to the groupthink of their profession will always do these things. And I don't think that recommendations will change that, because there were recommendations about what you do during a pandemic. And still they were saying things in Toronto, like if you're going out for dinner, you wear a mask to the table and then take it off at the table. But then if you're going to walk to the washroom, like, it was complete insanity. It was a mass hysteria event. Matthias Desmet says that. He's right. That is what we went through. And it's why many of us are still not doing well, because we saw something we thought could never happen here. So, I know that we have to say there can be recommendations, and we won't do that. My main one, after watching Tony Fauci plead the fifth, looking like a cornered rat, who allowed the deaths of many, many men with AIDS because he wouldn't make a decision around Bactrim because he didn't have the studies he wanted. That happened. I was in the room with him arguing about it, pleading for men. Men had pleaded with me, saying, "You're going in to see Tony. Please tell him to put the word out about Bactrim being a prophylax for pneumocystis carinii pneumonia," and he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. People in positions of authority in public health should be given personality tests, right? That's it.
Yeah.
I don't want a sociopath in there. I hate to be so blunt about it, but when you're talking about people making decisions in which people will die because of what they've decided, but they're steering their boat towards what the political class wants, we've got a problem. Jay Bhattacharya is the most normal and kind Christian human person I know. Put him in charge, which he kind of is now, right? Wouldn't have happened with him. Why? Because he's a better scientist? The science was actually pretty simple. It's what kind of a human being do we have in that job? That's what we need to be careful about.
Indeed. Marco, your comment?
I have a long list, but I'll just focus on a couple. One of the things that happened is the failure of the scientific community, the failure of science, and I would like to see somehow a series of policies that restores the pursuit of truth based on evidence in universities, in institutes, in governments, and that sort of stuff. We should have had scientists who should have worried more about the public effect of their cowardice than protecting their jobs.
Well said.
Medical officers, scientists, and so forth. And so what we need is to restore courage in our culture. Across the board, not just among them. Courage in the people who are panicked into this, courage in the professionals, courage in government officials and whatnot. The other one is kind of an offshoot of what has already been said so eloquently by Ken, is that we need to restore the emergency management chain of command in this country. The very reason we're talking about Fauci today is because Fauci was basically chosen for his PR appearance, and that is the reason. That is one of the reasons why we pitched the emergency management books out the window, because the politicians who would have had to stand in front of cameras to defend what they were doing feared, there's that word again, the opposite of courage, feared that people might not take them serious because there is such a deficit of confidence and credibility in politicians. And they figured that people trust doctors more. The bottom line is, beyond everything that we've discussed, is the enormous damage done to the credibility of medicine and medical people in this country. Most people who are thinking people don't trust their doctors anymore, and this is in many ways the side effect or the deep effect of that. So we need to restore the emergency management people. One of the examples that I came up with in the book that is kind of cute, but said, imagine if we had a volcano eruption and we throw the emergency management plan out the window and we find a volcanologist and we put him in charge, right?
Yeah.
That's it's the equivalent of that. We put an expert on volcanoes to deal with emergency issues that are immensely complex and have really nothing to do with lava running down the side of a mountain.
Absolutely. So comments well said. In good public policy, we recognize that there's different options and trade-offs, and we don't just simply put one party in charge. We try to work as a team looking at different trade-offs. So the whole idea of just shutting down schools or shutting down the economy or doing this and that is an absurd way to make decisions. You need to look at it in terms of the larger impact across society. It's interesting, the comments here, if we can show them up on the screen. My doctor is pushing the vaccine. No way do I trust her. So this is interesting. Today, in 2026, there's a perception, I think, that, is it appropriate to push so many vaccines? And I think this is actually a thoughtful opportunity to recognize hope, because I think there's much more skepticism about vaccines. I would have never said this, say, 20 years ago, where I think support for vaccines was pretty well universal. Now there's much more skepticism, as there should be, about really any drug. And I think that's where the revelations regarding the power of pharmaceuticals over all kinds of government decision-making is at really more the forefront of most people. I want to bring up a slide also about trust in institutions. And I think that's one of the impacts that we've alluded to. 61% lack confidence in the ability of public servants to plan for the future. And that's from Public Options Journal. And 67% lack confidence in the ability of public servants to spend taxpayers' money wisely. I mean, those are not very healthy percentages in our society. I think that's a real change. I could have gotten, back many decades where confidence was higher. So, Ken, is there a way to help rebuild institutional, confidence and trust in our institutions unless we have transparency here?
Well, that's a very good question. And when we did the NCI reports, you asked about recommendations. We made over 400 recommendations. But the way to restore confidence is rule of law. Rule of law. If you go out and you lie to somebody and it causes their death, you're responsible. The government isn't. If you go out and you change the facts and you perjure yourself, you're responsible. You're going to go to jail or you're going to be punished. The government isn't. And until we start to enforce the rule of law in this country, in other words, whether your name's David Leis or Ken Drysdale or Trish Woods or anybody else, any other politician you want to name, or doctor or banker or school teacher, until we do the rule of law, which means that the law applies evenly to everybody in every situation, period. Until then, until we start doing rule of law, we will not restore confidence in institutions unless we do it by forgetfulness, because I'm old enough that I know a whole bunch of those things. But the way to restore that isn't to cry in Parliament or to write letters. The way to restore that is for everyday Canadians, every day investing in their country. And I mean, 2 hours a week, I'm going to be involved politically. I'm going to run for municipal office. I'm going to run for the school board. I'm going to attend that legislative session, and I'm going to speak. And if you took 41 million Canadians, let's divide it in half because some are children, 20 million Canadians, then they spent 2 hours a week on their country. 40, that's 80 million hours a week. I can't do the arithmetic in my head, how many working years that is. But if Canadians would invest in their country and they would demand more and they would show up at their darn elections and they would show up and run for office, and they would show up at the legislature, and they would hold these people to account. We would then start to get rule of law, and then these people would be held to account, and then the government would fear the people, and that's what they're supposed. That's the relationship.
Mhm.
Well, my grandfather once said, my children don't do what I want them to do because they love me. And unfortunately, that's the human condition. And it should be the condition between the citizens or voters and their government. The
Mhm.
government should be, you know what, when you're not voting and you're not turning up and you're not making yourself known, and I mean blanketly as Canadians, as citizens, then why in the heck would the government listen to you when they've got these Pfizer's and whoever the else
Mhm.
groups in there spending money and making noise and squeaking? And of course they're not going to listen to you. So the solution is Canadians turn the darn TV off a couple of hours a week, because it's all it would take, and invest in your community. Show up. And I'll shut up in just a second, but I'll tell you a story, because I hear this all the time. I remember years and years ago, if my wife and I were going out to a party or something, the first thing she would say to me as we approached the door, Ken, don't talk about politics or religion. That's wrong. You show up, you talk about politics and religion, because whether or not you're going on a cruise this winter or whether or not you bought a new car is irrelevant. So start having relevant conversations, start investing in this darn country for once, because if you're not involved, investing in Canada, in my opinion, you're not a citizen.
Mm.
Being a citizen there's responsibilities to being a citizen.
Okay, so well said, Ken. I like your challenge, as you're the president, among others, other critical leaders, with what's called Manitoba Together. It's a real challenge that you're making to us as citizens to get involved, to put on our pants and to be able to get involved in the system. Otherwise, politics will do all kinds of things to us. And it's interesting, when you talk about relevant conversations, I have had conversations with my banker about what their stance was about debanking. I have also had conversations with my physician about the vaccines and shared that with them. So these conversations do matter. And I encourage everyone to take note of that, among so many others, and to get involved and to be informed. And I do want to share an interesting irony here. When we talk about Dr. Fauci in the United States, obviously there were many, many, many others involved. And one of them was a woman named Dr. Deborah Birx. You may have heard of her.
Scarf lady.
She is
Isn't she a colonel or a major?
Yeah,
I'm not
something.
it's possible. All I know is that she is distancing herself as they worked during the pandemic as twins. But I think she's distancing herself from Dr. Fauci. And I think these are examples where, from this tweet here, Deborah Birx, from her memoir, explaining how 2 weeks to flatten the curve was just marketing for harsh months-long lockdowns that she was really planning. So her insights were very much that they knew exactly where they were going in terms of lockdowns to make them long and harsh. And so I just want to share that tweet with you. But I think the point is that there's a lot of others that are being scrutinized. We'll see what happens to Dr. Fauci. I know that today he was found in contempt of the U.S. Senate, but that could result in some penalty. We'll see. I mean, others that have been on the other side have been actually put to prison. There's many other legal avenues that Dr. Fauci may be held to, and I won't go into the details now, but we do know that people are waking up, and I think you're onto something, Ken, that citizens have a role. So, Trish, do you think citizens have a role here to play, and what advice do you have for us?
Well, it's interesting listening to Ken, because I can get trapped a bit in my own cynicism. I've been at this for a long time, and one has to fight that, doesn't one? But I will say this, and I mean it from the bottom of my heart. I don't know a single person who stood up during COVID and told the truth who regrets it now, no matter how harsh the penalty, right? It's Dostoevsky said, live not by lies. That is a bracing, scary, I know, but a bracing way to live your life. And I think a lot of us learned about that during this time. And I think that knowing that makes us better people, because when you tell the truth in the moment, you don't always get a payoff, do you? Sometimes it's just awful, and the truth. But I don't think you ever regret it on issues like this. I am so proud that I didn't get the vaccine. I mean, I strut a bit about it, with my kids who thought I was a loon for not doing it. And in the moment, I was sort of scared and thought I'd be, ostracized. Well, I was ostracized. But my point is just live not by lies. Dostoevsky's right. We have to. Sometimes it's hard. But I think we know, and I'm sure everybody on this panel knew in some fiber of their being that we were being sold a load of crap. And that the public health policy was dangerous and cruel, and that the lining up of our friends and neighbors on that side was scary and historical, and that we were kind of in our own ways called to action, right? So speaking the truth when it's hard is a really good motto to live by, I think.
Right on. Well, I think that's a great reminder. How are we seeking the truth and living by the truth? And we have and cherish our relationships with all our neighbors and fellow Canadians. And so I really appreciate us coming together, Trish Wood and Marco Navarro-Genie, as well as Ken Drysdale, that we could have this conversation in that same spirit, trying to live by the truth, as that informs public policy and enables us to build a better country. So I want to thank you, all of you, for joining me in this conversation.
Nice
Thanks
to see
very
you
much.
guys.
Pleasure to be here.
So that brings to an end our program. I want to wrap this time up and thank our audience as well for joining us. And you can certainly, I appreciate the team effort here across MCA Media, our producer Lorraine, and of course, Addie is with us today. And you, our audience, and you can catch us across all kinds of channels and YouTube, across Merit TV Canada, and of course, our podcast. So we thank you very much again for joining us today, and for your comments. Keep them coming. We've had a very active audience today as we've talked about this important topic, and stay tuned. There's still more to come as we will come back to this topic again as appropriate. So be sure to join us next week, next Thursday, on the live edition on Leaders. And in the meantime, I hope you have a terrific week.
Here at Frontier, we don't receive any government funding. We are nonpartisan, and we work for you. Find out more and support this important work by visiting fcpp.org today.